You ever pick up something broken and realize it wasn't an accident? It was a message, because that's exactly what went through my head the second my boot pressed down on ceramic and I heard that sharp, hollow crunch echo through the quiet morning air, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a peaceful suburban yard at 6 a.m., and I didn't even have to look down to know what it was. I could already smell the damp soil mixed with that chalky dust from cheap paint and cracked glaze, and when I finally crouched, fingers brushing through the wet grass, I found the red hat first, snapped clean in half, still slick with dew, and for a second I just held it there, turning it slowly like I was trying to piece together something bigger than a broken garden ornament, because this wasn't the first time, not even close, and that's when something shifted in me, something quiet and cold, because up until that moment I'd been reacting, replacing, fixing, pretending it was random, pretending maybe kids were cutting through the yard or a raccoon got curious. But deep down I already knew. I knew exactly who it was, because every time one of my gnomes disappeared or turned up shattered, I'd catch that same look across the street, that tight little smile from Brenda Holloway as she watered her perfect, lifeless flower beds like she was curating a museum instead of living in a neighborhood. And I remember the first time she said something, standing right at the edge of my property line, without stepping over it, like she thought that made her polite, telling me my decorations were lowering the aesthetic value of the community. And I just laughed it off back then, said they were just garden gnomes, harmless. But what she didn't understand was those gnomes weren't random to me. They were something my dad and I used to joke about, something small and stupid that somehow made the place feel like home after he passed. And maybe that sounds ridiculous, a grown man caring about painted clay figures, but grief doesn't always show up in big dramatic ways. Sometimes it sits quietly in a tomato patch, tucked between rows of soil and sunlight, and every time one of those little figures went missing, it felt like someone was reaching into that space and pulling something out without permission, and Brenda kept doing it, week after week, always just enough to stay deniable, a tilt here, a crack there, until this morning when she pushed too far and turned it into something undeniable, because standing there with that broken red hat in my hand, listening to the faint hum of sprinklers and the distant rumble of a garbage truck rolling down Maple Drive, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the loud, reactive way I had been before. I was done arguing, done replacing, done pretending I didn't see the pattern, because the truth was I had already started noticing things. The exact time her motion lights flicked on, the way her front door creaked open just a few inches before sunrise, the path her footsteps cut through the grass where it dipped slightly near my fence line. And as I set that broken piece down on the edge of the planter, wiping my fingers on my jeans, I could feel it settling into place, the decision, slow and deliberate. Because if she wanted to keep touching my garden, then I was going to give her something to touch that she would never forget, something that didn't shout or threaten, something quiet, patient, inevitable. And as the morning light crept higher over the rooftops and the dew started to burn off, I stood up, looked across the street at Brenda's house, at the perfectly trimmed hedges and spotless driveway, and I swear for just a second, I saw her curtain shift like she was already watching, waiting for my next move. And that's when I nodded to myself, not angry, not rushed, just certain, because what she didn't know yet was that I had already stopped playing defense. And the next gnome I placed in that garden wasn't going to be like the others, not even close. I did not replace the broken one that morning. I left it exactly where it was, half buried in damp soil like a marker, because I wanted to see if she would notice, and more importantly, I wanted to see if she would come back. So instead of reaching for my toolbox or ordering another cheap ceramic gnome online like I had done before, I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the yard the way you watch something you are finally ready to understand, not fix. And right around the same time I had started noticing over the past couple of weeks, just after the streetlights flicked off and before the school buses rolled through, I saw it again, that faint glow from across the street, her motion light snapping on for a second too long, and then off, like someone had stepped just far enough to trigger it, and then pulled back, and that was when it clicked. Not just suspicion anymore, but a pattern, something repeatable, something measurable. And I remember setting my mug down real slow, the ceramic clink against the counter sounding louder than it should have in that quiet house. And I grabbed a notepad, nothing fancy, just something to start writing things down, because if I was going to stop reacting and start thinking, I needed to treat this like a problem, not a nuisance. And over the next few days, I stopped being the guy with the messy yard and started being the guy who paid attention to everything. The angle of the sun when it hit the fence line, the exact spot where the grass flattened slightly near the corner post, the way my porch camera barely missed that section by maybe 2 feet, just enough for someone careful to slip through without being seen. And every evening I would walk the perimeter like I was just checking on my tomatoes, but really I was mapping it in my head, step by step, inch by inch. And Brenda, she kept playing her part perfectly, waving at neighbors, chatting about property values, acting like the kind of person who would never step onto someone else's yard without permission. But there were tells, little things you only catch when you stop looking at someone the way they want to be seen and start watching what they actually do, like how she never walked her dog past my house anymore, how she always chose the opposite side of the street during the day, like she was creating distance on purpose, and then reclaiming it when nobody was watching. And that is when I realized something else, something almost funny if it was not so deliberate. She thought she was in control of the timing, like this was her routine, her quiet little ritual, and all I had done so far was let her believe that, because I had not pushed back, had not confronted her, had not even replaced the last broken piece, and the absence of a new gnome must have felt like a win to her, like she had finally cleared the yard of what she did not approve of. But what she did not understand was that the empty space where that gnome used to sit had become more important than anything I could have placed there before. It became the center of the plan forming in my head, because now I knew exactly where she would step, exactly where her eyes would go, exactly how close she was willing to get, and more importantly, I knew she would come back, because people like Brenda do not stop when they get what they want. They come back to make sure it stays that way, and that was all I needed. So instead of filling that spot right away, I waited. I let the grass settle. I let the routine continue. I let her get comfortable again. And during that time, I started pulling things out of my garage, tools I had not used in a while, scraps of metal, old brackets, a small camera I had picked up months ago and never installed, and I spread everything out on my workbench like I was piecing together something that had been sitting in the back of my mind long before this ever started. And as I stood there under the dim light, the smell of oil and sawdust in the air, I could feel that same quiet certainty from that morning settle deeper. Because this was no longer about replacing what was broken, this was about building something that could not be ignored, something that would turn her routine against her. And I remember glancing out through the garage window toward the street, toward that perfect house with the trimmed hedges and clean lines, and I almost smiled, not because I was enjoying it, but because for the first time since all of this started, I was not reacting to Brenda Holloway anymore. I was setting the stage, and she was going to walk right into it. The first piece I built did not look like anything special, and that was the point, because the more ordinary it appeared, the less likely she was to hesitate, and hesitation was the only thing that could ruin timing like this. So I started with the base, a standard garden gnome shape, about 18 inches tall, nothing flashy, just enough detail to blend in with everything I had placed before. But inside, that was where it changed. I reinforced the core with a steel rod, not heavy enough to be obvious when lifted, but just enough to alter how it felt in your hands, just enough to make someone pause for half a second longer than usual. And that half second was everything, because while I worked, I kept replaying the routine in my head, the motion light snapping on, the quick glance around, the reach, the lift, the turn, every step mapped out like it was already happening. And I adjusted everything to fit that rhythm. I installed a small camera just inside the brim of the gnome's hat, angled slightly upward so it would catch a face leaning in, not from far away, but right at the moment of contact. And I tested it over and over again in the garage, walking up to it myself, bending down, reaching in from different angles until I knew exactly what it would capture. And then there was the sensor, a simple vibration trigger connected to a small alarm unit I had tucked beneath the soil line. Quiet enough to stay hidden, but loud enough to break the silence when activated, not aggressive, not overwhelming, just sharp enough to turn a private act into a public moment. And as I wired everything together, I could feel the plan becoming less like an idea and more like something real, something that would exist whether she showed up or not. But I knew she would, because by then I had watched enough to understand that this was not about the gnomes anymore. It was about control, about her needing to shape the environment around her until it matched whatever standard she had in her head, and anything that did not fit that image had to be removed, quietly, repeatedly, until it was gone, and the more I thought about that, the more certain I became that she would not be able to resist coming back one more time, especially after a few days of nothing, after the yard stayed empty and undisturbed, because silence like that does not end curiosity, it feeds it. And I wanted her curious, I wanted her comfortable, I wanted her to believe the story she had already told herself, that she had won, that I had given up, and that nothing was watching. So when everything was finally ready, I carried the gnome out just before dusk, the air cooling down, the sky turning that soft gray that makes everything look a little flatter, a little less defined, and I placed it exactly where the last one had been, pressing it into the soil just enough to make it stable, adjusting the angle by inches until it matched the way the others used to sit, not too perfect, not too centered, just natural enough to look like it had always been there. And then I stepped back, wiping my hands on my jeans, taking it in the same way I had every time before, except this time I was not admiring it. I was measuring it against the space, against the pattern, against everything I had learned over the past week, and when I was satisfied, I walked back inside without looking over my shoulder, because looking would have meant doubt, and there was none of that left, only patience. And that night, I did something I had not done in a long time. I turned off the porch light completely, leaving the yard darker than usual, letting her motion sensor across the street become the only source of sudden light, the only cue in the entire scene, and I sat in the living room with the blinds barely open, not staring, not waiting in that tense, restless way, but just existing in the same space, letting time move the way it always does, because the truth was I did not need to chase the moment anymore. I had already built it. All that was left was for her to walk into it. And somewhere between the quiet ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of a car passing at the end of the block, I knew that when morning came, things would not go the way they had before, not for her, not for me, not for that yard that had finally stopped being a target and started becoming a trap. The alarm did not go off right away, and that was the first thing that told me everything was working exactly the way it should, because if it had triggered too early, too loudly, it would have broken the rhythm. But instead there was that brief, stretched moment of silence just before dawn where the air feels heavier, like the neighborhood is holding its breath, and I was already awake, sitting in the dark with the faint glow of the monitor reflecting off the edge of the coffee table, watching the camera feed I had set up hours before, not staring at it constantly, just letting it sit there, steady, patient, until the scene changed on its own, and then it did, right on time. A flicker of light from across the street, her motion sensor snapping on in that same sharp burst I had seen every morning, casting that pale yellow glow across her driveway and just barely touching the edge of my yard. And then I saw a movement, not clear at first, just a shadow breaking away from the darker line near her porch, but I knew that shape. I knew the way she moved when she thought no one was watching. Careful but not cautious, deliberate but never rushed, like someone who had done the same thing enough times to stop questioning it. And I leaned forward slightly, not out of excitement, just to follow the sequence, to confirm that every piece was falling into place the way I had planned, and she crossed the street without looking left or right, cutting diagonally like she always did to avoid the direct line of sight from most of the houses, stepping onto my lawn at the exact spot where the grass dipped just enough to soften her footsteps. And for a second she paused, not because she was unsure, but because she was scanning, making sure the stage was clear, and then her attention shifted, exactly where I knew it would, right to the gnome, standing there in the same position as the others had been, quiet, ordinary, waiting, and even through the grainy feed I could see that slight tilt of her head, that moment of recognition, of confirmation that something had returned that she thought she had already removed, and that was when she stepped closer, one foot, then the other, closing the distance with that same casual confidence, and I could feel the timing tightening, every second aligning with the next, and when she finally reached down, her hand entering the frame from above, fingers wrapping around the brim of the hat, the camera caught exactly what I had designed it to catch, her face leaning in just enough, eyes focused, expression unreadable but unmistakably intentional, and then she lifted it, and that was the moment, not dramatic, not explosive, just precise, the slight shift in weight as she realized it was heavier than expected, the subtle adjustment in her grip, The fraction of a second where her attention moved from the act itself to the object in her hands, and right then the sensor triggered, a sharp, clean tone cutting through the quiet morning. Not overwhelming but impossible to ignore, and her reaction was immediate. Not panic, not anything that would draw attention from across the neighborhood. Just a quick, instinctive glance around, her shoulders tightening, her posture shifting from casual to alert, and in that instant the camera captured everything. The recognition, the calculation, the decision, because instead of dropping it or stepping away, she held onto it, just for a beat too long. And that was all it took, because the system was not built to stop her, it was built to record her, to document the exact moment when choice turned into action, and as she turned, moving quickly now but still controlled, carrying it with her across the yard and back toward her house. I did not move. I did not rush to the door or flip on any lights. I just watched, letting the sequence complete itself, letting her believe she had finished what she started. Because the real moment was not happening out there anymore. It was already stored, already captured, already moving toward the next step. And as the screen settled back into stillness, the gnome no longer in frame, the yard quiet again except for the faint rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a car starting somewhere down the block, I leaned back into the couch, exhaling slowly, not with relief, not with satisfaction, but with certainty, because everything had gone exactly the way it needed to, and for the first time since this started, I was not wondering what she would do next. I already knew, because she had just done it, and now all that was left was to decide when to let everyone else see it too. By the time the sun came up, the neighborhood looked exactly the same, clean driveways, trimmed lawns, sprinklers ticking in steady rhythm like nothing had changed, and that was the part one appreciated the most, because from the outside, everything still felt normal, and Brenda counted on that. She counted on things staying quiet, unnoticed, easy to dismiss, and I let her have that morning. I let her walk out to her mailbox like she always did, coffee in one hand, posture straight, scanning the street with that same calm confidence, because she believed the moment had already passed, that whatever she had done before sunrise had folded neatly into the routine of the day, but what she did not realize was that the real part of the plan had not even started yet, because I was not interested in catching her in the act for myself. I already had that. What mattered was when and how it would be seen by everyone else, and timing that mattered more than anything I had built in the garage. So instead of rushing, instead of knocking on her door or calling anything in right away, I went about my day like nothing had happened. I watered the plants, cleaned up the remaining fragments from the older gnomes, leaving just enough evidence of the past without drawing attention to the present, and every so often I would glance at my phone, not nervously, just checking the feed, replaying the clip once, then again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be sure every detail was clear, every angle captured exactly the way I intended, her face, her movement, the moment her hand closed around something that was not hers. And as the hours passed, I started putting the next pieces together, organizing everything, timestamps, still frames, a clean sequence that told the story without me having to say a single word, because the strongest part of something like this is not the accusation. It is the proof that speaks before anyone can argue. And around mid-afternoon, I checked the community board online, the same place where Brenda liked to post reminders about trash bins and lawn height regulations, and I saw the notice for the monthly meeting scheduled for that evening. And that was when it lined up perfectly, because a room full of neighbors, board members, and Brenda herself, all in one place, all expecting another routine discussion about minor issues. That was the setting, not my front yard, not a private conversation, something public but controlled, something that could not be brushed aside or reinterpreted later. And I remember sitting there at my kitchen table, the light coming in through the window, casting long shadows across the surface, as I exported the footage, naming the file something simple, nothing dramatic, just a date and time, because I did not need theatrics. I needed clarity, and once everything was ready, I closed the laptop and just sat there for a minute, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the refrigerator kicking on, the faint sound of a car, doors slamming somewhere down the street. And I thought about how different this felt compared to a few days ago, because there was no frustration left, no uncertainty, just a steady, controlled sense of direction. And when evening finally came and the sky started to dim again, I grabbed my keys, slipped the small drive into my pocket, and stepped outside, the air cooler now, carrying that same calm feeling as the night before. And as I walked past my yard, past the empty spot where the gnome had been, I did not stop. I did not look around, because I already knew what was missing, and more importantly, I knew exactly where it was. And as I reached the sidewalk and turned toward the community center at the end of the block, I could see lights on inside, silhouettes moving, people gathering for what they thought would be another ordinary meeting, and I kept my pace. Steady, not too fast, not too slow, because the moment was not about confrontation, it was about letting the truth arrive at the right time, and this time, it was not going to stay hidden in the quiet of early morning. The room was already half full when I walked in. Folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, the low hum of conversation bouncing off the walls in that familiar way that made everything feel casual, almost forgettable, and for a moment I just stood near the back, letting my eyes adjust to the lighting, letting the scene settle, because this was where everything shifted, not with noise or confrontation, but with timing. And I could see Brenda near the front, seated with the board, posture straight, hands folded neatly like she belonged there, like she always had. Her expression calm, composed, completely untouched by anything that had happened that morning. And that was the part that almost impressed me. The consistency, the ability to separate what she did in private from how she presented herself in public. And I moved quietly along the side, taking a seat where I had a clear view of both her and the small screen set up near the front of the room, the one they usually used for neighborhood updates. And as the meeting started, everything followed the usual pattern: agenda items, minor complaints about parking, reminders about trash pickup schedules, the kind of routine that lulled people into thinking nothing important ever really happened here. And I let it play out. I did not interrupt, did not shift in my seat. I just waited, because the moment had to come at the right time, not too early, not forced, but natural, like it belonged in the flow of the evening. And eventually it did, when one of the board members opened the floor for general concerns, that brief pause where people either speak up or stay quiet. And I raised my hand, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. And when they called on me, I stood up slowly, feeling every set of eyes in the room turn in my direction, some curious, some indifferent, and I kept my voice steady, even explaining that I had been dealing with repeated property interference over the past few weeks. Nothing exaggerated, just facts, simple and clear, and I could feel the shift immediately, the subtle tension in the room, the way people leaned forward just a little, because now it was something different, something personal, and I did not look at Brenda right away. I kept my focus on the board, on the process, because this was not about calling someone out directly. It was about presenting something that could not be ignored. And when I mentioned that I had documentation, that I had recorded evidence of what had been happening, that was when I saw it, just for a second, that flicker in Brenda's expression, not panic, not even fear, just a brief tightening around the eyes, like something had not gone exactly the way she expected. And I took a breath, reached into my pocket, and placed the drive on the table near the front, the small, unremarkable object that now carried everything. And one of the board members stepped forward, plugging it into the laptop connected to the screen, and the room grew quieter, not silent, but close enough that you could hear the faint clicking of the keys as the file opened. And I stayed where I was, hands relaxed at my sides, not saying anything else, because there was nothing left to explain. And when the video started, it did exactly what it was supposed to do. No narration, no added context, just the early morning light, the empty yard, and then the movement, clear enough for anyone in that room to follow, step by step, moment by moment. And I watched the screen the same way everyone else did, not focusing on reactions, not searching for anything extra, just letting the sequence unfold, because the strength of it was in its simplicity. And as the clip reached the moment where her face came into view, unmistakable, close enough that there was no question of identity, the room shifted again, the quiet turning into something heavier, something more aware, and I did not need to look at her to know what that felt like, because the video kept going, showing the action, the choice, the movement back across the yard, and when it ended, it did not need anything else, no commentary, no accusation, just a still frame of an empty space where something had been taken, and for a second no one spoke, not the board, not the neighbors, not even Brenda, and I could feel it settle into the room. that understanding, that clarity, because this was no longer a story or a complaint. It was something visible, something undeniable, and I remained standing there, calm, steady, because the moment was not about what I would say next. It was about what everyone else had just seen, and that was something no one could take back. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like the room needed a second to catch up to what it had just seen, and I could hear it in the small sounds. A chair creaking, someone clearing their throat, the soft rustle of paper as one of the board members adjusted the agenda like it still mattered, but it did not. None of that routine mattered anymore, because the focus had already moved, and I finally turned my head just slightly, not enough to make it obvious, but enough to see Brenda. And for the first time since I had known her, she did not look composed. She was still sitting upright, still in that same chair, but there was a stiffness now, a tightness in the way her hands were clasped together on the table, her eyes not moving toward anyone, not even the screen, just fixed on a point in front of her like she was trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. And one of the board members spoke first, voice careful, measured, asking if there was any explanation for what had just been shown, not accusatory, just procedural, but the weight behind it was obvious, and for a moment Brenda did not respond, and that pause stretched just long enough for everyone in the room to feel it. And when she finally did speak, her voice was controlled, almost too controlled, saying it must have been a misunderstanding, that she had only intended to move something that she believed was out of compliance, that she was acting in the interest of maintaining community standards, and I could feel the shift in the room again. Not confusion this time, but something closer to disbelief, because the video had already answered that. It had already shown the timing, the intent, the repetition implied by how natural it looked, and I did not interrupt. I did not argue. I just let her finish, because the more she spoke, the more it became clear that there was no version of this that could undo what everyone had just watched. And another board member leaned forward, asking about authorization, about whether any notice had been issued, whether any formal process had been followed, and that was where the structure she relied on started to turn, because there was none, no documentation, no approved action, just a pattern of behavior that had stayed hidden until now. And I watched as that realization moved through the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a current you could not see but could feel in the way people shifted in their seats, the way their attention stayed fixed on her instead of drifting like it had earlier in the meeting. And then something else happened, something small but important. One of the neighbors spoke up, not loudly, just enough to be heard, mentioning that they had also noticed things going missing from their yard over the past few weeks. Nothing major, just small items, decorations, tools left out overnight. And another voice followed, then another, each one adding a piece, not coordinated, not planned, but connected in a way that made the situation expand beyond just my yard. And I stayed quiet through all of it, because this was no longer about proving my point. It was about letting the pattern reveal itself. And as it did, the board members exchanged looks, subtle but meaningful, the kind that happen when a decision is forming before it is spoken out loud. And Brenda tried to respond again, her tone sharper now, insisting that these claims were exaggerated, that people were misinterpreting normal enforcement actions. But the difference this time was that the room was no longer neutral. It had shifted, and once something like that changes, it does not easily go back, and I could see it in the way the questions came faster now, more direct, less careful, asking about boundaries, about authority, about the difference between enforcement and interference. And through all of it, I remained where I was, steady, hands relaxed, because the plan had never been to overpower her. It was to let the truth stand on its own until it could not be dismissed. And as the discussion continued, the structure she had relied on, the quiet control, the assumption that no one would challenge her, it all started to unravel, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a series of small, undeniable shifts, each one taking away a little more of the certainty she had walked into that room with. And by the time the board called for a brief recess to review the situation, the outcome was already clear in the way people avoided her gaze, in the way conversations started forming in low voices around the edges of the room. And I stepped back slightly, giving space, not because I needed it, but because the moment had already moved beyond me. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet hum return, I realized something simple, something that had been true from the start. that this was never about forcing anything to happen. It was about setting everything in place so that when the moment came, it would unfold exactly the way it was meant to. And now that it had, there was nothing left to push, nothing left to prove, only the result waiting to be acknowledged. When the board members came back from that short recess, the room did not return to normal. It settled into something quieter, more focused, like everyone understood that whatever happened next would not be routine anymore. And I stayed where I was, leaning slightly against the back wall, not trying to position myself at the center of anything. Because this was never about being seen. It was about what had already been shown. And as they took their seats again, one of them cleared his throat and began speaking in that careful, structured tone people use when they are trying to keep things orderly even when the situation has already shifted beyond control, outlining that they had reviewed the footage, that they had considered the statements made in the room, and that based on what was presented, there were clear violations of community conduct and unauthorized interference with private property. And he did not raise his voice, did not add emphasis, but the weight of it carried through the room anyway, because it was official now, no longer just something people had seen, but something that had been recognized. And I watched as that landed, not just on Brenda, but on everyone else too, because once something like that becomes formal, it changes how people process it. It moves from opinion to consequence, and Brenda shifted in her seat for the first time since the video ended. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment, but enough to break that rigid stillness she had been holding on to. And when she spoke again, it was different, still controlled. But there was an edge now, something tighter, less certain, pushing back on the interpretation, saying that her actions had been misunderstood, that she was trying to maintain standards, that she believed she had the authority to act. And the board member responded just as calmly, explaining that enforcement required process, documentation, and notice, none of which had been followed, and that distinction hung in the air, simple but decisive, because it separated intention from action in a way that could not be argued around. And then they outlined the next steps, not harsh, not exaggerated, just clear, that there would be a formal record of the incident, that she would be required to return any property taken, that there would be a review of her role within the community structure, and that any further incidents would carry additional consequences. And as they spoke, I could feel the room settling again, not into comfort, but into resolution, because people were no longer waiting to see what would happen. They were hearing it, piece by piece. And I did not look at Brenda directly, but I could sense the shift in her presence. The way the confidence that had filled the space earlier had thinned, replaced by something more contained, more aware of the eyes around her. And then something else happened, something I had anticipated but had not needed to force. One of the board members asked if there was any additional evidence or information that needed to be presented, and that was when I stepped forward, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to place a small folder on the table. Inside were still frames, timestamps, and a simple log of the previous incidents. Nothing excessive, just enough to show that this had not been a single moment, but a pattern. And I said only a few words, explaining that I had documented the previous occurrences as well, that I had tried to handle it quietly before, and that this was the first time I had chosen to bring it forward publicly. And then I stepped back again, because that was all that needed to be said. And as they reviewed the contents, I could see the final pieces falling into place, not in a dramatic reveal, but in a steady confirmation of what was already understood. And around the room, people began to shift their attention away from speculation and toward acceptance, small nods, quiet exchanges, the kind of subtle signals that show a collective decision forming without anyone having to announce it outright. And when the board member finally closed the folder and set it aside, there was a pause, brief but complete, and then he thanked me, not in a performative way, just a simple acknowledgement, and moved to finalize the discussion. And as the meeting transitioned to its closing moments, the energy in the room felt different, not tense anymore, but resolved, like something that had been uncertain had now been clarified. And I remained still for a second longer, taking it in, not with satisfaction or relief, but with a kind of quiet understanding, because this was the part that mattered, not the video itself, not the setup in the yard, but this moment where everything connected, where what had been hidden became visible in a way that could not be undone. And as people began to stand, gathering their things, conversations starting again in low voices, I turned toward the door, not in a hurry, just moving with the same steady pace I had kept from the beginning. Because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to push, only the outcome unfolding exactly the way it needed to, without noise, without force, just clear, patient, and inevitable. The night air felt different when I stepped outside, not quieter, not louder, just settled, like something that had been out of place had finally found where it belonged, and I walked back along the same sidewalk I had taken earlier, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, the kind that stretched just enough to remind you how still everything gets after a certain hour. And as I reached my yard, I slowed down, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to take it in, the space that had been at the center of all of this. The place where something small had turned into something much bigger without anyone noticing at first, and the empty spot near the planter stood out immediately, not in a dramatic way, just a quiet absence, a shape you could recognize even without seeing it. And I stepped onto the grass, feeling the ground firm under my boots, the faint scent of soil still lingering from earlier that morning, and for a moment I just stood there, looking at it, remembering how many times I had replaced what had been taken, how many times I had tried to fix something without understanding why it kept happening. And now there was nothing left to replace, nothing left to fix, because the pattern had been broken, not by force, not by confrontation, but by clarity. And I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not to check anything, not to review the footage again, but just to hold it there for a second, a small reminder of how something so simple had shifted everything. And then I slipped it back and walked toward the garage, opening the door to that familiar smell of metal and wood, the workbench still set up from where I had built the last piece, tools resting exactly where I had left them, like they had been waiting for this moment to pass. And I did not rush. I moved slowly, deliberately, picking up the materials I had set aside, because there was one more thing I wanted to do, not as part of a plan, not as a response, but as a choice. And I worked for a while in that quiet space, the soft scrape of tools, the steady rhythm of shaping something new, something that was not built to catch anyone, not built to prove anything, just built to exist the way it was meant to from the beginning. And when I was done, I carried it back outside, the weight balanced in my hands, solid but simple, and I placed it in the same spot as before, pressing it into the soil just enough to hold, stepping back to look at it in the dim light. And this one was different, not in a way that would stand out to anyone else, but in a way that mattered to me, because it was not part of a setup, not part of a sequence. It was just there, steady, quiet, belonging. And I stood there for a moment longer, listening to the faint hum of the neighborhood settling into the night, the distant sound of a car passing, the soft rustle of leaves along the fence line. And across the street, Brenda's house was dark, no motion light, no movement behind the curtains, just stillness. And that was all it needed to be, because there was nothing left for her to come back to, nothing left to control. And I turned toward the house, wiping my hands on my jeans out of habit more than anything. And as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, not the kind that comes from winning or losing, but the kind that comes from knowing something has been set right in a way that does not need to be repeated. And I moved through the house, turning off the lights one by one, the space returning to that calm, familiar rhythm it had before any of this started. And as I paused by the window one last time, looking out at the yard, at the small figure standing where it belonged, I realized something simple, something that had been there the whole time but only made sense now, that the loudest part of any conflict is not the resolution. It is the time before it, when everything is uncertain, and once that uncertainty is gone, once things are clear, there is nothing left to raise your voice about, because justice does not need to announce itself. It just needs to arrive, and when it does, it stays quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore.